Last time we took a wonderful look at the inside of this sweater, and I really appreciate looking at how other knitters knit up their works, especially when you compare the original pattern with this finished product, because the original pattern is written for a size 34-36 inch bust, and this is knit up to a 38-inch bust. So today I'm going to be trying to figure out how to take the combination of this sweater, because it fits me because I'm a size 38, not 34-36, and the original pattern, and making a machine knit pattern for myself. Sorry, you might hear that I am not doing my best. I did mention that I was starting to feel a little bit sick last time, and I don't think I'm going to get a full-blown out sickness, but I'm not feeling the best, so please excuse me if I'm not as fast or coherent today as I might normally be. And also you might be a little confused because I know that the next video that you'll see, I'll seem absolutely fine because I filmed that a while ago. So the first thing that I want to talk about is, I think so far, all of the patterns that were originally written to be hand knit that I have then knit on my knitting machine were generally meant to be knit flat. My vintage hand knitting machines, not hand knitting machines, knitting machines, only capable really of knitting flat. I mean, you could kind of do in the round, but it's complicated if you're thinking about color work and everything. It takes away some complexity because I don't have to reconfigure that part of the pattern. Most of the figuring out and work today will be me kind of sitting at the computer, but I hope that I can kind of explain or talk through what I'm doing to hopefully make a little bit better sense of what I mean when I say that I set up a hand knit pattern to be done on the machine instead. The other thing about this sweater in particular is the color work pattern. My knitting machine, and I think a lot of knitting machines, at least the vintage ones that I've considered and looked at, the color work happens in repeats of 24. So my knitting machines came with their own sets of punch cards, and the punch cards are what tells the machine how to do that particular bit of color work. And I don't have punch cards specifically for this pattern, but I do have the tools to punch my own punch card and make my own pattern, but I can only do that if the pattern repeat is even over 24 stitches. So that's one other thing that I'll look into, is if this pattern is something that I could create a punch card for, because that would make my life a little bit easier. What I'm really excited about is this top portion. There are some things called intarsia carriages. I know this isn't intarsia work, but I don't know that much about them, but that would be my only guess as to how I could potentially do this kind of pattern on my knitting machine using the punch cards, because this is definitely not a 24 stitch repeat. Like, this is mirrored. So with my particular machine and the technology and that, I cannot use the automatic color working bit of it to do this color work. However, that is part of the reason I have been thinking about this sweater for so long. So the video that I released in, I think maybe October, in the fall sometime, where I did Fair Isle on my Bond machine, was so that I could learn to do that technique on a machine that didn't have a color work reader or mechanism to do it for you automatically, how to do that manually, so that when I'm working on this yoke, I knew how to do this bit of it manually. My biggest question is on making sure to catch the floats. I had someone ask me that in the last video, and catching floats, you might see here, I'm gonna just hold this up from a bit far away, it kind of looks almost pixelated a little bit. If you ever have like a modern machine knit sweater that isn't like particularly high quality, maybe some of the high quality ones too, you would hope not, they're not always done to the most amazing standards. You'll look in the back when there's color work sections and you might see like really long strings kind of just hanging loose. And you might notice a lot when you're putting it on or taking it off, especially if you have those big long strands loose over the sleeves, because when you're putting your arm in the sleeves, your fingers might get caught underneath those strands. Those strands are called floats, and it becomes a real problem of like durability of a sweater, because those floats are going to snag on things. For me, they snag on my earrings. I don't wear a ton of earrings all the time, but I have a tragus piercing that I always wear, and I have noticed that bad float management will catch on my tragus piercing. I notice that it catches on my fingers, on my nails. It happens a lot of times. Like I said, I wear these sweaters over other shirts or undershirts, and so that might rub and pull the tension out of place. So that is a really big part that kind of wears down a sweater. And so higher quality sweaters, they will have better float management so that the big pieces of strings aren't like that. And what I mean by that in this hand knit example, well, look, I can tell that this is the other side of the mousse right here. So we'll look at that. Technically, if the float management wasn't as amazing as it is, you would have one big blue strand of yarn from here to there. But you can see that every once in a while, there's like a tick of white yarn coming across it. And that's because the knitter basically wrapped that white yarn around the blue and caught the floats with the other color, which doesn't show up on the front as long as you don't stack your float catching. If you do that, you will see it on the front. So that's another thing to think about when you're looking into color work. And you know, a lot of people talk about that, but just like terminology or things that you might look up if you're trying it for the first time. But that allows those strands to not be as long. There's still little bits of strands, of course, that maybe if I had like, I don't know, the tiniest of fingers or like a long pointy fingernail would still maybe be able to get underneath that. But we're talking about that distance rather than that entire distance of a float. I just went on a really long conversation about floats and I don't remember the full point. Oh, yes. So I guess part of the point of what I'm trying to say is if I do the automated color work, like if I find out that I can make a punch card, but as far as I know, right now, as of this moment, I don't know of a way to do float management when I'm letting my machine do the color work. But when I do it manually, like I did with a bond machine, when I did the Fair Isle on that manually, there are ways that I can catch the floats, which I think is very important for this top bit because the floats are quite long. All right, I'm at my computer now. I've got the pattern pulled up on this screen. I've got the spreadsheet on that screen and my sweater. I am going to be writing this up with a little bit of like future-minded planning in mind. One of the things that I noticed in a lot of the comments is that people are finding it hard to find the pattern. And even if they can find the pattern, again, it is only written for sizes 34, 36, which is not so easy. So I had mentioned before that this is a strong contender to be my next knitting pattern that I release. As I'm writing up this pattern for myself, I'm also going to be hopefully writing this in such a way that will help future me scale and grade this pattern. I'm going to start with the sleeves because they're a slightly smaller piece and I think they might be a little bit easier for me to grasp. You definitely want to note gauge first. This is both in my original pattern and in my version of the sweater. I probably also need a measuring tape. Let me grab that real quick. I'm going to have a column for, well, I guess the other thing is I need a row gauge because the original pattern, does it have a row gauge? Typical for vintage patterns not to have a row gauge because I think Claude of Retro Claude has mentioned this before. Typically you aren't told to you're told to cast on X amount of stitches for the bottom ribbing and then knit for 2.5 inches, not knit for 20 rows. Row gauge is very, very dependent on each individual knitter. So even if you're using the same needle size, so my mom and I can use the same needle size and hit the same stitch gauge, so in the width, but we have different row gauges. Because also my camera thinks that that is a face. Hello. I still want to measure a row gauge because I have to compare it to what I can get on my knitting machine. So that'll be another thing is I'll take a gauge swatch because on my knitting machine I have to add weights, so I can't measure my piece as it's hanging on the machine because it's stretched out of proportion. So I'll have to knit a gauge swatch and then with that gauge swatch compare it to the row gauge of all of this. Instead of saying knit on my knitting machine for 2.5 inches, I'll know exactly how many rows I need to do in order to do that. About 6 rows an inch. Okay, so the original pattern says, here we go, this is going to be cast on 44 stitches, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 40, 42, oh, 44. Okay, so they didn't change the dimensions, at least at the bottom. That's enough of that for now. And then I'm going to make another column, I guess that's about like machine pattern. So this is in, I'm gonna, because I need to make the machine pattern a formula so that when I plug in the machine gauge in stitches and rows that I can basically have that generated for me. So 44 stitches divided by stitches an inch. So that's 8 inches. So gauge, and then this is going to be machine knit gauge. I'm going to do my best on a machine knit sample to hit 5.5 stitches an inch, but I don't know if the machine knit sample will hit 6 rows an inch. So that's the main thing, again, that I'm trying to just account for here. Account for here. So it's that times that. I just filled in the same for now, just to double check that my formulas are going to be correct because the numbers should match. But then when if I update that, then I'll know that I need to do that. Okay. So the original pattern says to knit for 3 inches. Did the original knitter knit for 3 inches? I would say almost. Like, they probably meant to knit for 3 inches. They're just if I were them, I would have knit like 1 more row, you know what I mean? So I think we're very close. So, because I just have matching gauges and rows. Okay, so then we knit for 3 inches or 18 rows in all cases. And then the next set of instructions doesn't seem like they increased the arm size much. I generally like the arm size in the original pattern. Yeah, it's slightly baggy, which I like, but not particularly oversized. It's baggy enough that if I want to, I can wear something underneath it, and I don't feel like I've got like layers stuck to me. I have issues with that. I can't deal with that. Now I'm gonna look at the dots pattern because I think, well, I'll double check when I get to the front and back pieces, but I think it's consistent with the front and back. Is it a multiple of 24? 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. I think it might be a 14 stitch repeat. Yep, okay, so I did this correctly. So then I guess the question is, what is the repeat on this? So if my knitting machine would be able to do this as a repeat. Would that work? I said, okay, so we do this, and then it repeats, and then it repeats, and then it repeats. Does that work? It looks like it works. I do think it's a 24 stitch repeat. That would be so nice. Okay, so I could actually make a punch card pattern for this. How cool is that? That's kind of perfect. By the way, I like how this pattern calls the dot pattern snowflakes. It's a very cute way of saying it versus the traditional Lusekofta, which is lice. I also prefer to think of them as snowflakes. I'm trying to decide where to put in the guarantee of similar length sleeve, because I think what might make all of this a little bit easier is if I were to make the machine knit sample first, like gauge swatch first, because then I would know, like if I'm at 6 rows an inch, just like the pattern, like my sweater is that I have, then I know I'm okay, because then I can say, you know what, sorry, I feel like 90% of my thoughts are happening in my head and I am not expressing them very well. But basically, if we have a row gauge mismatch, and I'm saying like every 8 rows increase, after some time, like if I do that 8 times with 2 different row gauges, we're going to have different length sleeves. So I just need to put in the correction for the sleeve length somewhere. Does that make sense? And I think it's easier to do it not in the increases, but after the increases. Probably explained that really terribly, but so that I understand this correctly for machine knitting, I would say you're at 59 stitches to increase. So one of the things that I might also put in there for myself is that we're at 18 rows, and then we increase, so row count. This allows me to double check what I'm doing with my pattern on the machine is correct, if it matches the counter. So I'll be at 19 rows there, and then I'll be at 22. Again, this is if stitch counts match. It might change when I do the gauge. And then when sleeve measures 5.5 inches, so that's 5.5 times 6. So that's how many more rows. So we actually have to add that to it. So at this point, we should be at 55 rows. Work in pattern until sleeve measures 18 inches from the beginning, including ribbing. Okay, the sleeves are over 19 inches. Yeah, they're like 19.5, and I want mine to be actually an entire inch longer. So this one's 19.5, and I want mine to be 20.5 inches, which is in total. So I should be at that times that rows. So I did actually end up getting sicker than I expected after all, so it's taking me a little bit longer to get this video edited and out. And as I've been editing it, I realized that I have about 3 hours of raw footage of me translating this pattern into my machine knitting pattern. And I don't know that you need to see all of it. I don't know how excited you might be to see all of that. If you want more, let me know. But I decided to kind of leave you at that point. I think I discussed a few interesting things about this pattern and a few considerations that I do in order to translate something from a hand knit pattern to my machine. But if you want something more in depth, please do let me know. But for now, I think I'm going to pause myself and skip ahead in time to when we're going to go do some swatches on the machine. And we'll look at the yarn that I chose for this sweater. I think what I might have time for tonight, I do have to go to bed pretty soon, but what I might have time for is knitting up a quick gauge swatch on my bulky machine, because I think I'll have to use the bulky machine to hit the right gauge, and seeing what that looks like, and maybe we can type that into the Excel spreadsheets to see if we're close to the original gauge or not. By the way, the yarn I've decided to use is Swish DK. It is from Knit Picks, and this one is kind of perfect because it says 5.5 stitches to 1 inch is the gauge for this for knitting, which is exactly what we need. So it's a DK weight sweater, just in case you're wondering, and it's a fine superwash merino wool. It's exactly what I want for my sweater. I want it to be something superwash so that I can wash it. Probably won't be washing it in the washing machine, but even when I wash it by hand, I feel a little bit better when I'm washing a superwash because it makes me not so worried. So let me go wind this into a center pole yarn ball and then get to my machine. I actually think that the tightest tension is the one that hits 5.5 stitches an inch. Well, actually, this is still, it gets squashed a little bit. So if I do a touch of that, I think maybe a tension 1, because this is a tension 0 and that's a tension 2. About 5.5 to an inch. It's between 6.5 and 7 rows an inch. So with it being 6.5 to 7 rows an inch, so I'll put in 6. Well, here's the thing: the fabric of this yarn feels quite sturdy, if that makes sense. The sample that I made feels very much a little bit more flowy, which I don't mind. But it does mean that it is a stronger candidate to block to the correct dimensions. So I'm wondering if I knit it to the original row counts and then I block it to the intended size and see if that might stay. Because the way it sits on the machine, because it's a bulky gauge, and this is kind of that weird gauge where we're really spreading the stitches far apart, the way it's knit up makes the stitches even wider than they are tall than normal knitting, like hand knitting would. So I'm thinking that blocking, like knitting it to the 5.5 stitches, 6 rows an inch gauge might actually be better, and then to block the final piece that way, because then the piece might actually stay that size more appropriately. I don't know if any of this is making sense, but the nice thing about machine knitting is that I can do multiple times and try out different things and see what I think. So I think that might be this take where I knit to the original gauge and then I block it to size and see if that will work out appropriately. But next time, I think what'll be really fun is like I said, got a bunch of this bare yarn, and I'm going to attempt to dye it to match this color. I couldn't find the exact shade online. I think they might have new shades now, and some of them look pretty close, so maybe I could have waited and gotten the closer shade by not having to dye it myself, but I love dyeing yarn. I'm going to try out some acid dyes, so if you're interested in that, feel free to stay tuned. I'm so excited to be working on this sweater. Again, I'm sorry for my maybe slightly low energy and low coherence. I'm just not feeling my best today, but I'll see you very, very soon. And thank you again so much for joining this whole journey. It's so fun. Craftmas is always so fun for me. Okay, bye.